This is a case study video for The Guardian, the 4th of September 2015 edition of just the front cover, and this is only for section A. The Sun is for section A and or section B, but this is only for section A, which asks you to analyse the front cover. So this is component 1, exploring the media, focus areas, media language, representation and media contexts. Production context. The Guardian is a British national daily newspaper with an average daily circulation of roughly 1,809,000 copies of their print edition in the UK. The Guardian newspaper targets a well-educated, relatively young, predominantly male and liberal audience. The demographic is 89% ABC 1, 52% of Guardian readers are male, and the average reader age is 44. The Guardian has an UK online edition which has over 42.6 million readers as of October 2014. In 2006, The Guardian went through a complete redesign. It became smaller, had a new typeface, and balanced the longer pieces of journalism out with many shorter stories. The reason for this were twofold: to adapt to what was all going on in the market, The Independent and The Times had already changed to a tabloid format, and to adapt to people's reading habits, with people now having little time to spare and increasingly reading on the go. Part 1. Starting points. Media language. Social context. In March 2011, civil war in Syria broke out, and an estimated 11 million Syrians have fled their homes since then. The majority of these have sought refuge in countries that border Syria, but an estimated 1 million have requested asylum in Europe. Families have been broken up, and many are making dangerous and difficult journeys across land and sea to get to what they consider a safe place. Opinions on these migrants vary. There is a lot of support and aid being offered by individuals and charities, but there is also a lot of fear and uncertainty about how countries will cope with the increased populations and the impact such migrants will have on their societies. Cultural context. It is expected that the audience will recognise the two robots portrayed in the top third of the magazine. This recognition of such icons and their very famous film franchise helps to create social inclusion and a shared knowledge and cultural understanding. It is also a subtle form of advertising, as the front cover is dated 4th of September 2015, just 3 months before the release of the latest film in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens, and the day that all the new merchandise will be released. These images can be considered to be intertextual references that the audience will spot and then be able to bring a shared understanding to the text. Consider how media language creates and communicates meaning. Unlike many of its counterparts that use block capitalised text for their mastheads, The Guardian's masthead is written all in lowercase and uses a curved font. This uniqueness makes the newspaper stand out from the crowd when competing for sales on the newsstands, and arguably is a more personal mode of address, one which offers an alternative form of journalism to the rest of the country. The dominant image of the two little boys who drowned, along with their mother who is not pictured, whilst crossing from Turkey to Greece, gives a human face to the Syrian refugee crisis. The image depicts happy little boys, wearing typical clothing and a cheeky smile. This human angle is a common convention of the news, as it allows the readers to engage with the stories on a more personal level, and the use of children is particularly effective as they are often associated with innocence and vulnerability. The photograph is anchored with a caption which reads, "Aylan and Galib Kurdi have drowned after the boat they were in capsized," and the headline, "The boat flipped, they just slipped through my hands," explaining their deaths as wholly accidental. The emotive language used at the start of the article, anguish, tragedy, and in the lead paragraph, disaster and devastation, evokes a huge sense of sympathy from the reader. The audience is positioned in such a way so as to support these families and to apportion blame to Europe's governments and international authorities who have created this crisis and allow it to continue. Consider how choices of elements of media language portrays aspects of reality and conveys messages and values. Alongside the main article, there is a linked article about how the Prime Minister at the time was under increasing pressure to allow more refugees in Britain. The phrasing of the headline, PM bows to pressure, attempts to show David Cameron in an unfavourable light, stating that he felt that he should agree because so many people were putting pressure on him to do so, suggesting that the Prime Minister doesn't agree with the idea or wish it to continue. When placed alongside the main article, and more notably the image of the little boys, the subtext is that he lacks compassion and empathy for these victims of war, arguably reflecting the values and political leaning of The Guardian. Consider the codes and conventions of media language. A much smaller part of the front page is given over to G2 Film and Music, a regular segment in the paper which, because of its placing, when displayed on newsstands may well be the section people see first. This entertainment segment offers a lighter alternative to the hard-hitting news stories of the rest of the newspaper, and may well be a reason why people chose this paper over others, many of which will undoubtedly be covering the same main stories. Iconic images of R2-D2, C-3PO and Woody Allen amongst others engage part of the target audience who will be familiar with these, and the reference to acid and rave classic along with Emma Stone may be appealing to their younger readers. Possible areas for further investigation. Codes and conventions of newspaper covers, layouts, use of cover photographs, images, house style, mastheads. Narrative. Headlines used to tease people to want to read certain stories. This could be linked to Roland Barthes' Enigma codes. Active-passive audience. Historically, readers of print newspapers were considered to be passive, i.e. they read what was in front of them and believed it, especially as there is an expectation that what is shared in the news genre is true. However, today's audiences are much more active and can interact with the news they read. They have the option to read it online, comment and discuss below an article, as well as sharing it on social media. This potentially changes the way they interpret the information they are given. Part 2. Starting points. Representation. Political context. The Guardian is described as having mainstream left political values. It does not have an affiliation with any political party, but does lean towards the left and has a very liberal tradition. It is therefore not surprising that the language of the two main articles seeks to apportion blame to the European governments, suggesting they are the reason for this crisis, and also paints a picture of an uncaring Conservative Prime Minister. It is also unsurprising that they are presenting an alternative viewpoint to the more right-wing press, encouraging their readers to see the refugees as victims of war who deserve our help. The Guardian isn't owned by a group of shareholders like most other newspapers, for whom making a profit is the most important thing. Therefore, they believe that they can hold true to their core journalistic principles. Consider the representation of refugees as a social group and the representation of the migrant crisis as an issue. The text of the main article is carefully constructed to position the audience into accepting the newspaper's viewpoint, analysis and opinion. The image and the language used position the Kurdi family, and therefore all refugees, as blameless victims. It is a story of personal tragedy, which in other circumstances unrelated to a migrant crisis would be viewed as a heartbreaking catastrophe by all who read about it. However, in the political and social context of the Syrian refugee crisis, this is the kind of story that divides people. Some consider it the father's fault, and suggest that they shouldn't have been making the crossing in the first place, as the journey to Europe is too dangerous and unnecessary. Consider theoretical perspectives on representation, such as selection and omission. In other words, picking representations to put in the newspaper and leaving some out entirely. The selection of this particular image could have been to show how they look just like any other youngsters, their nationality being irrelevant. The previous day, the image used by many newspapers, including The Guardian, was a much more shocking image of Aylan's body being carried by an official. The Guardian could have used this image again, or a similar one, but didn't, and it's worth considering why that was. Consider the functions and uses of stereotypes. In contrast to the unfavourable dominant media stereotype of refugees as potential terrorists, benefit scroungers and criminals, this image serves to remind the readers of the reality of the situation and show just how desperate many are to flee their homes in search of safety. The two boys are also being used in this context, perhaps to represent all migrant children involved in this war, and once again highlighting their innocence, vulnerability and defencelessness. Possible areas for further investigation. Theoretical perspectives, for example Stuart Hall, representation, stereotype, selection, omission, and perhaps how in some ways this newspaper front page has sought to move away from the more typical right-wing representations of refugees and the migrant crisis. It would be helpful to compare this article with another from the tabloid right-wing press, such as The Sun, which often paints refugees as potential terrorists, parasites and people to be despised and or feared. And that's it. That's all the case study.